In the northwest corner of China, the land looks empty. A flat expanse of pale sand, bleached bone white under the sun. But when the light shifts and the wind changes, the ground reveals shapes, long ridges, slight depressions, lines that shouldn't be there. Beneath them lie the oldest graves in this desert, silent markers of a people lost to history. When archaeologists first uncovered them, they expected the usual, scattered tombs, facing random directions, like in most prehistoric burial fields. But something was wrong. Every compass needle pointed the same way, east, grave after grave, row after row, all turned toward a single horizon. It wasn't superstition, it was geometry. The team logged every angle, feeding coordinates into their software. The numbers formed a curve, not straight, but deliberate, bending slightly north as if tracing the sun's path across the sky. Coincidence, someone said. But coincidences rarely make patterns that repeat with mathematical precision. At dawn, the archaeologists decided to test it. They stood among the tombs, waiting for the first light. When the sun finally broke over the ridge, it poured directly across the burial ground, illuminating the tops of the mounds one by one, as if waking them. It wasn't random. The light was hitting them in sequence, perfectly timed to the rise of the sun 4,000 years ago. What kind of people would build a cemetery like a clock? The site, known now as the Gumugu Cemetery, lies near the old channels of a vanished river. 4,000 years ago, this was not desert, but delta, green marshland fed by melting snow from the Kunlun Mountains. It was a place where light, water, and life met. But then the river died, and with it, the world that sustained these people. All that remains are their graves, aligned to a sky they must have trusted more than the earth beneath them. As the dig expanded, they found variations, clusters of graves arranged in groups of 12 or 13, others in arcs that matched the sun's seasonal extremes. The archaeologists ran solar simulations to check. At the summer solstice, the first grave in each arc caught the earliest sunrise. At winter solstice, the last one did. Between them, the others marked the year's slow turning. Were these people trying to measure time or remember it? Inside the graves, the bodies were wrapped in woven grass mats, facing east, arms crossed over chests. A few carried wooden masks, painted red, their eyes outlined in black. Their faces looked toward the sunrise, as if waiting to wake. Around them lay offerings, carved bone tools, small beads, traces of cloth, all placed with eerie precision. Nothing about it felt accidental. And then came something stranger. While mapping the graves by drone, a researcher noticed that from above, the entire cemetery formed a shape. The rows curved slightly north, then west, creating a pattern almost identical to the constellation Orion as it appeared in that sky 4 millennia ago. The odds of random alignment were low, but the proof wasn't absolute. The idea sparked debate across the camp. Some said it was deliberate. The dead were placed beneath their sky-bound reflections. Others called it human pattern seeking, a trick of imagination. But one archaeologist, Mei Zhang, couldn't shake a detail. When she overlaid the digital sky from 2000 BCE over the map, the tilt of the graves matched the arc of Orion's belt. Not perfectly, but close enough to matter. They were watching something, she said quietly. Maybe not Orion, but something that moved the same way. What could make a civilization align its dead with the stars? As the excavation continued, the team uncovered strange wooden posts beside some graves, each one angled slightly different, like markers of direction. When reconstructed, The posts seemed to trace the rising points of the sun throughout the year, a primitive solar calendar built into the burial ground itself. In one grave, a post had fallen and burned centuries ago, leaving a dark scar across the sand, a frozen line of light that once marked a season now forgotten. Night after night, the researchers checked their data. The more they measured, the more the site refused to fit into neat categories. It was too precise to be random, too ritualistic to be merely scientific. Every new layer uncovered another question. Why east? Why light? And why this relentless need to face the dawn? In ancient Chinese cosmology, east was the direction of renewal, the realm of the azure dragon, symbol of spring and rebirth. To face east was to face life's return, not its end. The Gumugu people might not have written that belief down, but they lived it, building a field of sleepers all turned toward tomorrow. Yet something else was hiding beneath that symbolism. When the scientists tested soil samples from under the graves, they found faint traces of salt and silt, evidence of a dried lake bed. This entire burial site may once have been an island or shore, surrounded by water reflecting the sunrise. If true, the dead weren't just facing the light, they were facing its mirror. The whole cemetery may have been designed as a ritual horizon, sky above, reflection below, a bridge between worlds. Still, one thing didn't fit: the precision of the layout. Even accounting for rough tools, the axes were almost uniform, some within 2 degrees of each other. To achieve that, they would have needed reference points, repeated measurements, maybe even instruments we've never found. How did they do it? By the time the first full site map was complete, it showed over 200 aligned graves, forming intersecting curves. The main axis pointed toward the spot where the sun rose at the start of spring 4,000 years ago. From there, the pattern expanded like ripples in sand, each line marking a season, each grave a date. It looked less like a cemetery and more like a message. At sunset, when the desert cooled and the wind stilled, the mounds cast long shadows stretching west, their lines meeting at the horizon, where the sun disappeared behind the mountains, day's end and life's end crossing paths. The same pattern, repeated in reverse. Were these people building memory itself, something that could outlast their language, their names, their rivers? One night, the archaeologists stayed late, running time-lapse footage of the stars above the site. The camera caught a subtle moment. As Orion rose, its lowest star aligned exactly with the central row of graves. It lasted less than 2 minutes, then drifted out of place. A cosmic heartbeat, faint but real. No one spoke. The wind picked up again, erasing the day's footprints from the sand. Somewhere under that surface, an ancient order slept, one that measured dawn and dusk not as opposites, but as part of the same circle. And as the desert swallowed the last light, a thought lingered in the stillness. Maybe these people weren't facing the sunrise to worship it. Maybe they were warning us what happens when the light changes. The next morning, before sunrise, the team returned to the site. It was cold, that kind of sharp desert cold that cuts even through layers of cloth. The wind had wiped away all footprints from the night before, as if the ground had decided the living had no place here. They waited in silence, instruments ready, cameras pointed east. And then it happened again. The light. The first faint line of gold broke across the ridge and slid across the sand, spilling perfectly along the row of graves, one after another, in an order too exact to be chance. Every tomb caught fire in sequence, not flames, but reflection, light bending on the old stones and bones below. It looked like the desert itself was remembering. The archaeologists exchanged glances, half scientific, half spellbound. Dr. Maizhong whispered, "It's not the sun that moves. It's their time that moves through us." No one replied. Back in camp, they checked their measurements again. The azimuths matched. The graves that caught first light in June missed it in December, and vice versa. This wasn't just east-facing, it was timed. Each grave tuned to a different sunrise, a different day. Someone 4,000 years ago had built a calendar out of death. And then came something even stranger. Buried near the northern edge of the site, they found a narrow wooden box sealed tight under layers of clay. Inside, wrapped in animal skin, was a thin piece of carved bone covered in shallow grooves, 16 of them. At first, it looked decorative, but when Zhang laid it on the map of the cemetery, the grooves matched the spacing of the tomb rows exactly. It was as if the builders had kept their own key, a codebook made of bone. The team didn't announce the find right away. They spent days verifying it. The pattern wasn't perfect, but it was too close to ignore. Was this the memory code? The blueprint they used to arrange their dead? In later dynasties, ancient Chinese texts spoke of the way of heaven mirrored on earth. The Book of Rites described burial directions as moral geometry, aligning the soul with cosmic order. But this was long before written history. The people of Gumugu had no known script. If they encoded anything, they did it in direction, not words. And somehow, that code had survived 4,000 years of silence. When the data reached Beijing, astronomers were brought in to run sky simulations. They fed the coordinates, the site's elevation, and the year 2000 BCE into Stellarium. The software showed the sky just as it would have appeared back then. The alignments pointed, again and again, to the horizon point of the sun's equinox path, and to a faint cluster of stars above it. Orion's belt almost invisible to the naked eye in that low dawn light. Coincidence? Possibly. But the angles were consistent enough that even the skeptics hesitated. It wasn't just east, it was precise. The discovery spread quietly among academic circles before leaking online. Headlines called it China's Stone Calendar of the Dead. But the reality was stranger than the headlines could hold, because the graves weren't stone. They were sand, wood, bone, and they shouldn't have survived this long. That was the second question. How had they lasted at all? When the archaeologists dug deeper, they found that each grave had been sealed with a mix of ash and salt. Natural desiccation, but with a strange consistency. Chemical tests confirmed it wasn't just from the environment. It was added deliberately. Salt, a purifier in early rituals. Ash, the residue of burned offerings. Together, they formed a crust that preserved everything beneath. These weren't just burials. They were preservation chambers, time capsules made to defy decay. But if the builders had this much knowledge, where did it come from? The Tarim Basin, isolated now by desert, was once a crossroads. Traders from the west, nomads from the north, and early farmers from the east all passed through. In that meeting of cultures, ideas mixed: astronomy, ritual, myth. Perhaps what lies beneath Gumugu is not one civilization's code, but the memory of many. The team started calling it the Field of Eyes, because every tomb faced the same horizon like a single gaze. And that gaze wasn't random. One evening, Zhang noticed something on an old satellite image. A faint, straight depression in the earth, about 400 meters west of the main cemetery. It looked like a dried canal or causeway. When they traced it, it ran perfectly parallel to the line connecting the graves. At its far end, a circle of stones, eroded, barely visible. The next day, they went to check. It was small, no larger than a campfire ring, but the ground around it was burned black. Inside, fragments of charcoal and pottery. They tested the soil. The burn layer was from the same time as the graves. A ritual fire, a signal, or something else. Something that connected the light of the dawn to the final act of burial. They recreated the alignment. Standing by the fire circle, you could see the entire cemetery stretched before you. And when the sun rose, it crossed directly over the center of that line of graves. It was a straight path, carved from earth to sky. At that moment, even the scientists fell silent. They weren't standing in a random field of bones. They were standing inside a message. What if every tomb was not just a grave, but a word in a sentence we still can't read? What if those who built it weren't worshiping the sun, but trying to make sure the sun remembered them? As the evening fell, the wind picked up again. Sand moved like water over the mounds, soft and endless. Each gust erased a footprint, filled a trench, blurred a line. Yet somehow, the pattern remained. Thousands of years have passed, dynasties risen and vanished, and still the dead of Gumugu face the same horizon, their alignment unchanged. The archaeologists packed their tools and watched the desert reclaim its silence. But before leaving, Zhang stood one last time at the fire circle. She held up her compass. The needle trembled, pointing not perfectly east, but a few degrees north, toward the rising point of the equinox sun, exactly as it had 4,000 years ago. For a moment, she smiled. "They were right," she said softly. "Even the light remembers." The others turned to look, but by then the sun was gone, and all that remained was the quiet certainty that they had uncovered something vast. Not just a burial ground, but the memory of how humanity once tried to speak with the sky. By the third week, the desert had changed color. The dunes turned from gold to silver in the cold light of morning, and the air carried the stillness that comes only before revelation. The camp was nearly silent now. No chatter, no rush of excavation. Only the measured sound of brushes on sand, GPS units beeping softly, and the faint hum of drones circling overhead. The team had stopped looking for artifacts. They were looking for logic. Each new grave confirmed the same geometry. Eastward, slightly tilted north, set with mathematical care. But something was different now. They began to notice smaller tombs, children perhaps, placed not directly east, but slightly off the main line. When plotted, they formed another shape, one the software revealed only from above, a spiral. It began in the center of the main alignment and curved outward, each rotation wider than the last, as if measuring distance through time. A spiral, the oldest human symbol of life, death, and return. Dr. Zhang stared at the map on her laptop and whispered, they weren't just marking sunrise. They were marking movement. The spiral pointed directly toward the horizon, where the constellation Orion rose during the spring equinox of 2000 BCE, the same horizon that defined their entire cemetery. but there was no way they could have known its celestial coordinates, not without instruments, not without records, unless memory itself was their map. They decided to test it again, this time with full motion capture. Under a moonless sky, the team set cameras and sensors along the spiral's curve, each marking one of the ancient graves. Then they waited. At 3:42 a.m., Orion appeared on the horizon, its three belt stars rising in a perfect diagonal that matched the curve of the spiral. 3 stars, 3 turns, 1 pattern. The entire site lit up under the cameras, each point connected by faint starlight, turning the cemetery into a mirrored reflection of the sky above. It lasted only moments. But in that brief silence, no one breathed. It wasn't exact, never exact, but it was close enough to make them question everything they thought they knew about the builders. Back in the tent, they replayed the footage frame by frame. At the peak of alignment, Orion's belt aligned with the spiral's center, the oldest grave, marked by wooden poles long rotted away. Zhang spoke slowly. Maybe the first person buried here wasn't just a leader. Maybe they were a point of origin. The idea unsettled everyone. A culture mapping their dead to the sky, one body at a time, generation after generation. Each new burial adjusting the pattern slightly to match the heavens' slow drift. It meant they were tracking precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis, thousands of years before anyone had a name for it. Was it possible? The astronomers doubted it, but when they compared ancient alignments from other sites across China, Yangshao, Lingjiatan, Liangzhu, they found similar rotations. Each one slightly offset from true east, following the same millennia-long drift. Different people, different places, one pattern. It was as if a shared memory had passed silently from one generation to another, not as words, but as direction. The next morning, a sandstorm swept across the site, halting all work. Tents collapsed, instruments were buried, the desert roared. The storm lasted 6 hours, and when it ended, visibility was gone. The horizon itself had vanished. The team gathered in what remained of their central tent, faces pale with exhaustion and sand. Zhang looked outside, toward the line of graves barely visible through the dust. "They built this to face the sunrise," she said. "But what happens when the sky disappears?" Her question hung in the air. The burial code wasn't just geometry. It was hope against oblivion. Even if the river dried, even if the desert swallowed everything, they would still face the light. That night, after the storm passed, the sky cleared like glass. The stars came out sharper than ever, millions of them. The archaeologists, half in awe, half disbelief, walked out to the center of the cemetery. Their lanterns cast faint halos, and for a moment, the horizon glowed again. The wind, still restless, swept over the graves, drawing new lines in the sand. Someone noticed the lantern shadows formed the same spiral shape they had mapped earlier, almost as if the land itself was answering them. Zhang raised her light and turned it slowly east. "Look," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The shadow stretched ahead, directly toward the horizon where the first rays of dawn would soon appear. At that instant, she understood. It was never about worship. It was navigation. The dead were not being guided to heaven. They were guiding the living to remember where the sun would return. For a civilization with no writing, no surviving myths, this was how they wrote their history, across sand, shadow, and light. Each grave, a coordinate in a story that began with one sunrise and was meant to end with another. Zhang closed her notebook. She didn't write a word. She simply stood there, the wind around her whispering the same rhythm she'd heard since the day they arrived. The sound of memory, ancient, patient, unbroken. When the sun finally rose, it traced the same old path over the horizon, bathing every mound in gold. And in that quiet light, every question they'd asked seemed smaller than the silence that answered. Were these people astronomers? Priests? Survivors marking the rhythm of their world's end? Or were they, like us, just trying to remember where they came from before everything turned to dust? The light kept moving, slow and perfect, as if nothing had ever been lost. By the time the final surveys were done, the team had stopped talking about data. They spoke instead of the silence, the way it filled the air after every discovery, as if the desert itself was listening. For weeks, they'd lived among the graves, measuring, charting, debating. But something about this last stretch felt heavier. The wind had carved faint trenches between the mounds, revealing deeper soil layers, darker and older. Beneath one of the larger graves, they found a second chamber. Inside were the remains of two people, buried together, facing east like the others. But between them lay a polished stone disc, the size of a small bowl, perfectly smooth. Under the flashlight, it reflected a faint line of light, splitting it like a miniature horizon. At first, they thought it was just symbolic, a sunstone perhaps. But when they set it level and aligned it with the first light of morning, the beam fell directly onto the heart of the grave. It wasn't decoration, it was design. That discovery changed everything. It meant the builders had engineered light itself to enter these chambers in a specific way, at a specific moment. The graves weren't simply facing the dawn. They were made for it. The researchers ran an experiment. They covered the chamber, leaving only a slit at the eastern edge. Then, they waited for sunrise. At 6:14 a.m., the beam entered perfectly, illuminating the two skeletons' faces before fading. It lasted barely 2 minutes, but it was exact. 4,000 years later, the light still knew where to go. It was as if the builders had reached across millennia. Programming the sun to return. When Zhang stepped into the chamber afterward, her breath fogged in the cold air. "This isn't memory," she said softly. "It's persistence." Back at the camp, the team compared this site to other ancient alignments. In Ireland, Newgrange. In Peru, Chanquilo. In China, this, Gumugu. Different continents, different cultures, but the same idea. The dead facing the light, their architecture built to remember what the living forget. one of the astronomers ran the timeline backward. When the alignments first began here, the sun rose 4 degrees south of where it does today. The builders knew. They adjusted. Generation after generation, they buried their people in slightly shifted rows, tracking the sun's slow drift. It was not faith. It was observation, the science of memory. But if they could measure time that way, why didn't they write? Why no markings, no inscriptions, no language left behind? Maybe they didn't need one. Maybe direction was their language. The bone tablet Zhang found weeks earlier might not have been a code, but a key. A portable map to reconstruct the pattern if it was ever lost. It wasn't words they wanted to save. It was alignment. And so, the final theory emerged. The Gumugu people weren't building tombs. They were building continuity. Every grave was a compass, every sunrise a reminder. Light fell on the dead, so that the living could see where to stand. That night, Zhang sat alone at the fire circle, the same spot where dawn first touched the site. The stars were fierce above her, the Milky Way a pale river crossing the sky. She thought about the old river that once flowed here, the one that gave the desert its life. It was gone now, buried under centuries of dust. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the people of Gumugu knew rivers vanish and languages die, so they built a system even the desert couldn't erase. At dawn, she took her compass one last time. It pointed east, steady, true. But she wasn't looking for direction anymore. She was looking for meaning. As the sun rose, its light hit the graves in the same perfect rhythm. She whispered to the wind, "You didn't build for the dead, did you? You built for the ones who would forget." The wind moved softly across the sand, almost like a reply. A low hum filled the stillness, the sound of air rushing through the hollows between graves, echoing faintly like breath. And then, for just a moment, the reflection from the polished stone disc flared across the desert floor, landing directly on her hands. She froze. The beam lingered, warm and golden, then faded back into the earth. It was over in seconds. But something had shifted. For all their science, their models, their graphs, nothing could explain that final alignment. The moment when light found her in the same way it once found them. The others joined her in silence. No words, no applause, just stillness. The sun rose higher, and the shadow of each mound shortened until they disappeared completely. The line between past and present vanished. Zhang looked once more toward the horizon. The graves, the spiral, the silent code, they were all saying the same thing. Nothing truly ends. It only changes direction. And maybe that was the message the dead had written into the sand. A code the living would rediscover every time the light returns. She turned away slowly, her footsteps vanishing behind her. The desert swallowed the sound, just as it had for 4,000 years. Only the wind remained, carrying the same rhythm that once guided an entire civilization toward the dawn. A pattern older than words, stronger than dust. The last line of her field notes read only this: "When the sun rises, the dead rise with it.